on the importance of really considering or making sure you have them in place, and if you have them, making sure you take a look at them and keeping them current. And then I'm also going to discuss the difference between a policy and a procedure, because there's some misnomers there. What a policy is, what a procedure is. Sometimes they're commingled, and I write a lot of commingled policy/procedure. So you have the policy statements, then you have the detailed procedure part of that. And then in common issues, as I go out and do gap analysis for companies, or they send them in to me to take a look, I see some issues, and I try to, correct those, or at least share some of the things I've seen. And then truly the benefits. The benefits is very important, and I'll discuss how it can really help your organization and help protect not only your company, your employees, but also your customers and your areas that you service. And then, like I said, at the end, we'll have 3 case studies, things that didn't go so well, things that could have been avoided, that cost some propane marketers quite a bit of money to settle some claims. And then at the very tail end, I do have a sample table of contents that I would share with you to show you. If anybody wants that, you can certainly contact my colleague, Michelle Wilson, as well as myself and or Ted, and we'll get you a sample table of contents for your consideration to look through to help give you an idea of policies and procedures that you should consider for your organization. And I'll also show an example of one and how it should be written and detailed with the policy and procedure as well. So, policies and procedures. We're going to have a survey question. How many of you have them and you have them written? It's very important, if you're going to have them, that they're clearly communicated, because each employee needs to understand the responsibilities and then also what the company direction is when it's based on a policy. Are they available to your employees? Often I find a lot of the policies and procedures that aren't available to their employees as they need direction or as they need further guidance, they're not available. With technology today, I would strongly encourage you to look for apps that you could actually house those policies and procedures on the smartphone so they're always available to your employees. Are they maintained? That's one of the bigger things. Maintaining and how often do you review those? Maintaining your policies and procedures are very, very important, because if you don't maintain them and it's not meeting the minimum requirements of what needs to be done based on national, state, local, federal laws and rules, and you do something wrong, that could hurt you. But also reviewing your policies and procedures at least annually, saying, has anything changed in our business? Are we doing something today that we didn't do this time last year? Or did we remove something from our business unit that we're no longer going to be doing? So updating your policies and procedures to exclude those things that you're no longer practicing or doing. Because it's very important. We all think, even with written policies or without written policies and procedures, that everybody's doing everything consistently the same way. But what I see in the field, and I do a lot of work in the field with a lot of training, employees have their own way of deciphering certain procedures or policies, or have some misnomers about code and what code really says they should be doing. So we're not all on the same page. And what we're trying to do with written policies and procedures is really putting everybody on the straight and narrow. There will be mistakes that are made, but at least gives you an opportunity to control what's happening and being able to really evaluate your employees to ensure that they're doing what is necessary for not only your consumer, but to protect your company. Excuse me. So why is it important to have policies and procedures? Well, they do play a very important role with defining your company's guiding principles. So the policy part of it really gives the vision, the guiding principles for the direction of the company. So it really doesn't matter if it's safety, if it's training, if it's human resource related, if it's financial with accounting policy or procedure. It just gives you the guiding principles as an organization of how you're going to do things and kind of the vision of the company. It also provides you detailed task instructions, and that would be the procedural part of it, where it really talks in depth with certain procedures, or at least gives the baseline of what an employee should know on how to handle certain situations or how to complete a task. Provides consistent day-to-day basic structure for your business operations for your organization. The consistency, having that consistency is so important, ensuring that each and every person understands their roles and responsibilities and has clear direction day to day. I've given 3 depositions in my time, and it's very important when you go in with deposition or even just anything that's taken place that everybody understands the process. Everybody has the same structure and the same understanding on how to complete it. We may complete it a little bit differently, but it's important that we know what the company baseline procedure is for that. And then improve safety levels by establishing rules that concur with your state and federal workplace regulations. At a minimum, your policies and procedures should always cover the baseline, meaning the federal, the state, and local rules that are established for your service areas. That way you ensure that your employees understand the expectation of taking care of these processes related to propane day-to-day operations to at least meet the minimum code. You can establish company best practices as part of your policy and procedure. And I've often been asked about that. Well, best practices, does that put me at more risk? Well, as long as you're meeting the minimum requirements of the standards, the codes, and the rules that are out there, and you're attempting to demonstrate or you're attempting to have a higher care or a level of care for your customer, even if you're not hitting that 100% every time, that is truly raising the level of care for your customer because you're going above and beyond the minimum standards that are set by code. So what is the difference between policies and procedures? Well, naturally, policies are really intended to bring the company's vision to life. So you're going to have all walks of your business, whether, like I mentioned previously, human resources. It's very important to have human resource related policies. It's also very important to have a safety, training, compliance mission to set the standard for the company and how you're going to follow the rules and regulations and how all employees will be brought up to speed on what those rules and regulations are. There's a general guide for all your employees at all levels. And I work for a large company that had 1,100 employees, and it's very important that you have commitment from your senior level management, your ownership, your CEO, right down to the last part-time employee. Everybody has to understand and buy in to your policies. Describes your company rules as well as consequences. So we all need to understand what the rules are, but we also have to be trained on what the consequences are if we don't follow the rules. Not following the rules by an employee should result in certain disciplinary action, because when you have policies set forth and they're not being followed, or they don't get followed and someone gets injured or an accident occurs, you have to discipline your employees as part of the policy. If you don't discipline them, part of the policy, and discipline could just be verbal warning. It could also include termination, but you have to show that there's enforcement of your policy. Otherwise, in the eyes of the federal rules, whether it's DOT, whether it's OSHA, when they come in, they're going to say you don't have a policy because you're not enforcing it. And then to make certain that the policies are well understood. They're usually written, and I strongly encourage you to have them written, because that way you can communicate those. And then I'll talk a little bit here in a minute about how to train and how to onboard your employees. And they only really change as the company direction changes, which, hopefully that doesn't happen that often, but your main vision usually is a path you're going to set, and that's where you're going to stay the course, unless something changes to where you need to change your business strategy. And then you would look at all your policies and understand how those would need to be modified. As far as procedures, they're more specific. They're going to really document who, what, when, and how a task is performed. So task performance, very important. It gives really guidance on the company procedure on how do we handle an out of gas situation with no one home. So it really gives the employee the understanding of what the company policy as well as the procedure would be on handling that. For instance, customer's not home. Do you fill the tank? Do you do a leak check? Do you lock off the tank? Do you not fill the tank? Do you just tag the system? Those are procedural based things that your employees would need to understand. And then procedures tend to cover individual actions that an employee can take given a certain situation. So it allows them to understand what their limitations are based on their training and their exposure to certain job tasks. So it allows them to perform these procedures based on their knowledge and their understanding. And it also helps avert possible issues of someone not doing something correctly, because now it's documented on how they're going to handle these tasks. And they also cover activities not only at your locations, but we all work remotely. we work at customer locations. So some of the things with doing a safety evaluation, even just simply a delivery driver making the pass, he or she making their pass to the tank to make a delivery, or a service technician that's going to go do a service call, or a tank installer that's going to go out and set a new propane tank installation, really needs to understand how to evaluate the site, how to check for exposures, how to look for safety hazards that should be eliminated, or maybe they can't perform those tasks. Some of the common issues I've seen with policies, one of the biggest things is they're not always written, and if they are written, sometimes they're often too general or too vague or too generic in nature. And I'll talk about the Coca-Cola incident from several years back and what that cost Coca-Cola here in a minute. They're not kept up to date. I've walked into facilities and asked to see their policy and procedure manual, and they haven't been even looked at for years. They had dust on them, so it really needs to be part of your calendar that you look at them, whether you want to do it quarterly, whether you want to do it semi-annually, or whether you want to just look at them annually. But it really needs to be looked at. And then not readily accessible. We often have them so they're in the manager or the owner or the general manager or someone's office where they're not accessible, and they really need to be accessible. And by no means am I saying print out a whole entire policy and procedure book and give it to all of your employees, but there are certain parts of that they need to have exposure to, and they need to be trained on. And they don't always clearly identify the company rules and how they apply. So you really need to make sure the policies are clear and concise and how they are going to apply to each of your work groups, your designated job assignments. And then the lack of enforcement, which I've already mentioned, understanding why they exist. Enforcement is key. If someone does something incorrect, there has to be some type of action, whether it's a verbal warning, written warning, whether it's a suspension, depending on the severity, to show that the policies are in place and that they're being enforced. So the lack of enforcement can really just render them that as if you don't have any policies and procedures in place. And then some of the common issues I see with procedures, as with policies, they're not reviewed and updated periodically. Procedural wise, they really need to be kept current with what local code, state code, federal code say. They need to be kept current, because that could put your employees at risk if they're doing something based on a procedure that is outdated or doesn't meet what the requirements say they need to be doing. And they often don't identify specific actions or explain when to take action. So it's important for them to say if there's a situation, how should they handle it? Is it simply just notifying management? Is it getting some assistance? They need to understand how to take action or not to take action. And then often they fail to provide emergency procedures. Just recently, through the Gent, West Virginia, through the Chemical Safety Board, I was on PERC at the time. We were asked to relook at all the CTEP training materials, which are great materials, and a lot of their safety literature and a lot of their warnings and cautions are great materials. And I would encourage all of you to make sure you use those materials as part of your training and compliance and how you communicate to your customers. But all the CTEP trainings were all updated to provide emergency procedures on how to handle propane emergencies, which is very important as part of what we do day in and day out. And then often procedures lack the warnings or cautions. So just making sure employees understand, be cautious. Here are things that can go wrong, or wearing PPE will help prevent, things of that nature. And they don't always give examples or show how to complete forms and documentation. So if you're going to have forms, you're going to have documents, it's so important that you fill those out correctly and that someone is analyzing that information, or you have some mechanism, some electronic mechanism to allow you to understand that your documentation is okay. I review a lot of documentation on an annual basis, and 30% of it is either incomplete or not there or filled out incorrectly. I can strongly encourage you to really take a look at what you're doing internally and how you're handling your documentation. And for propane documentation, it's so important to keep that for the entire time you service the account. And I would recommend at least 3 years after you've quit servicing the account. The benefits of having sound policies and procedures. Naturally, employees are provided with the information that allows them the freedom to really do what they need to do on a day in and day out basis as part of their job. It allows them to make decisions within defined boundaries. So they don't overstep corporate rules. They don't overstep things that they haven't been trained for. They understand what it is they can do and how they can take care of situations with your customers. And then also employees understand the constraints of their job without trial and error. And that's one of the bigger things. A lot of the newer employees, until they're fully trained, or if they're not fully trained, a lot of them, you could end up having employees trying to feel like they're doing the right thing because you're in a tough situation, you're busy, it's wintertime like we have right now, cold weather, everybody's under a lot of stress, we got customers that need to be serviced, we got this, we need that, and then all of a sudden we're not trained and we don't do the right thing, and we think we are, and we make a mistake, and that's where accidents and incidents do occur. So this would allow them to at least to understand if they haven't been trained and they haven't had the full understanding of what a task is or how that task gets handled, they can at least stop and say, I need some assistance. And that doesn't put them in a situation where they feel embarrassed or they feel, I'm going to get in trouble if I don't understand this way of handling it. And then it also allows your workforce to clearly understand their individual goal and how it relates to the team responsibilities of the day-to-day business of providing high quality, efficient service and products to your customers. And then also everyone's working off the same page, which creates consistency throughout your company. Having everybody working together, pulling towards that common goal, whether it's safety and training related, whether it's customer service related, whatever it could be, it just puts everybody together working equally to tow the company flag. So how safe are your employees? We often don't think about this, and I'm not here to promote DeWalt tools, but that's a pretty powerful tool, but more importantly is, when we're at job sites, we may even be working alongside other contractors. It's important to identify aspects of what we do for our consumers as it relates to the safety at that site, even working with other contractors. Do you have a distracted driving policy? And I'll talk about the Coca-Cola litigation claim that they settled several years back for I think about $21 million, but it's important that we're putting more and more technologies in vehicles today. It's so important, and most of the insurance underwriters today have made sure that their clients have a distracted driving policy, only because it opens you up to so much litigation. That could happen to any of your companies, any of your drivers, if they don't understand their responsibilities under the federal rules, under the state rules, but more importantly, under your company rules on how you're going to handle distracted driving. So Coca-Cola was hit with the $21 million distracted driving judgment back in 2012. And basically, Corpus Christi, Texas, they awarded $21 million in damages to a woman who was struck by a Coca-Cola driver who had been talking on her cell phone at the time of the accident. And basically what the plaintiff's attorneys were able to successfully argue was Coca-Cola's cell phone policy for its drivers was vague and ambiguous. They also suggested that Coca-Cola was aware of the dangers but withheld information from its employee driver, which led directly to these circumstances. In fact, I don't have the disclosure on it, but I think the employee of Coca-Cola also sued their employer for not providing them with the necessary information of the dangers of driving while talking on the cell. So really, the takeaway here is this case emphasizes just how serious the risk is, and that all employers can be vicariously implicated if they fail to manage and monitor how your employees are using mobile devices while driving. Not just driving. It could be issues where they're using mobile devices within the work areas and something goes wrong. But employers who want to minimize your liability, this could go for any policy or procedure, you should really consider instituting risk management programs to actively or passively enforce your company policies and procedures. And more importantly on this one, with cell phones, and any electronic devices that could distract your drivers out there on the highway. So, are you prepared to defend an incident? You don't want this to happen to you, but it could happen. It may not be your negligence. It may be a situation that just occurred from a do-it-yourselfer, but it still puts you in a vicarious position to try to defend. When we take a look at incidents, and you're looking at what the jury thinks, the jury always has high expectations for us as the propane company. They also, because of the nature of our product, they already consider it, because it can catch fire, it can explode, it can do a lot of damage to property, that the product itself, and we should have the highest degree of care. We are the gas company, is what they look at us. We're the big gas company, even though we could end up being a small individual, one location company, we still are the gas company. And the playing field is not always level. When we're walking in there, it's not level against us as the gas company. And when you have injured parties, in particular, when you have kids that have been injured or killed, it's very difficult. The juries are always rooting for that injured party. And a close call will usually go to the injured party, and the burden of proof is always put on us as the gas distributor. So the juries expect the gas company will have properly trained personnel. I can't stress that enough. Training is key. So you really need to have a training policy on each, do your job safety analysis for safety concern, but also specifically saying for each of these positions, what training should an employee accomplish? Doesn't have to necessarily just be a CTEP training. There's a lot of other trainings available, but in order for them to do certain activities or certain installations or certain service, what training should they accomplish? For new employees, equally as important. As you onboard those new employees, having a training standard or protocol that you can follow consistently for each of those job positions is very important as well. Following codes and standards. So having your employees understand what the codes and standards are, whether they're federal, whether they're state, or whether they're local, because the jury's going to say, you should know these. You work in the industry. Your employees should be trained to these. You should protect our consumer, our customer that is now injured. Provide safety information about our products. Very important that we provide the safety information. Duty to warn is so important with the propane side of our business. Providing that duty to warn, meaning upon it initially taken on an account, really showing them where the tank is, how to shut the tank off, if it's safe to do so, should they suspect they have a gas leak. Having them smell and verify the odorant, typically ethyl mercaptan, and signing off on that, and providing them with the safety literature, which I recommend. The PERC literature is really good literature to hand out. And then having a program that you provide information on an ongoing basis as part of your work orders, as part of your delivery tickets, and then annually specifically mailing to each of your customers a specific safety information piece of literature that says important propane safety information enclosed, to provide that update on an annual basis for them to learn more about how to protect themselves. And then document that you provided that safety information. So, out of gas situations, this is one of the things that leave us exposed. We have not a lot, but we have incidents that occur based on out of gas or interruption of services. So what is your policy and procedure? Give some thought to that. Do you have one? Has it been communicated? Has your entire staff been trained on that? It all starts with a call. As a call comes in and they're out of gas, how do we handle that when we answer the phone? And how do we disseminate that information and put that onto our delivery dispatch? Or some companies also have service technicians that are involved with putting in a small amount of product and restarting the system. As far as documentation, on any interruption of service, it is so important to not only follow the rules by reinstating the service and conducting the leak check, but making sure that leak check information has been documented. So if it's a driver that's performing the delivery to the out of gas situation and they're going to reinstate the service, it's very important for them to record that information and have it so it becomes part of that permanent customer record that you've completed that leak check and there was no leaks found. And consistency, having the script, understanding when you answer the phone, if it's an interruption of service, how do you handle that with the customer? Are you going to communicate to them that someone needs to be there. We need to gain access to be able to reinstate the service. So it begins with the call. And then when is the system out of gas? Have a good understanding of what that is. Basically, a system that's considered an interrupted service or out of gas is a system that does not have enough pressure to substantiate the operation of all appliances connected to that system. So understand your policy. Some companies, when it gets below 5%, they automatically consider it an out of gas. But you need to do that verification. The driver needs to understand if there's any doubt, verify whether or not the system's still operating. If they can't verify that, the recommendation would be to treat it as an out of gas. And then making sure you have everything documented. I can't stress that enough. Documentation, documentation. Do you have a pre-fill safety inspection? While you may have things that occur, this one is a 420-pound cylinder that's in the ground part way that should not be in the ground, but it's also located just below a direct vent appliance termination. Drivers are usually the ones that go back on a regular basis. This may not cause the incident, but having a code violation or having any of these code violations at a customer's location could keep you into a litigation claim longer than you need to be. Even if it's not your fault, they could say, well, you have code issues here. And it could leave you into a claim longer than you need to be, like this regulator not being, located 5 feet from the condensing unit. It happens to be right near the air intake for the category 4 furnace that's in the house. So having an understanding what those rules are. Even simply with your tank sets, making sure you have the proper distance between your containers as required by NFPA 58, as well as crash protection that's required. I don't think the safety cone or the trash can is going to provide the necessary protection for those containers. So having that and having a mechanism for your drivers to turn this in to get these issues resolved is very important to an ongoing process. How are your records? Making sure that all your records are filled out completely and detail the information of services that are provided and any system testing that was done. So having leak checks that filed away here showing a leak, after a 5-minute leak check, or not having an end time, not having an end pressure, not having a start pressure. If you're doing leak checks that are intermediate or high pressure leak checks using either a 0 to 30 pound, 0 to 300 pound gauge, showing that initial pressure and then bleeding down the pressure that safeguards you to show that you actually had the tank shut off and that the valve was not leaking through to re-energize. So having that and understanding the correct procedure on how to document that is so important. And then customer denials, very important with customer denials. So if you give a recommendation to a customer and it's denied, customer chooses not to have the service or repair performed, really making sure you have a record of that. So having your technicians, your installers, or your drivers fill out the denial saying they recommended something and it was denied. Customer should sign. If the customer refuses to sign, they should make an indication customer refused to sign. But verbal agreements are not an official record of a denial. And then how you write the denial is very important too. First bullet, I told Mr. Jones the circulator was noisy. The correct way for that service really should be during service, I noticed the circulator was not operating properly and suggested it be replaced. Mr. Jones said he wanted to wait until next month. So now we have that documented. We can put that in a come up file and check with Mr. Jones next month to see about making that correction. So we have that documentation as part of the customer file. So we're to the case study. So I'll go ahead and stop here, Ted, to see if there's any questions that we may need to answer before we get into these 3 case studies.
We do have one that came in. Anyone else, if you do have a question, please feel free to type it into the question section. Could you just give more detail in regards to documenting training an employee? What steps what steps do you need to take, and what does that involve specifically?
Well, training employees, now you got existing and you got reoccurring training, and then you also have new employees coming in. So you really need to create, first off, what the training process is going to be and what the protocol should be. But first, the documentation. You need to have documentation, even for policies and procedures for onboarding, that not only for the policy portion that they received, they read, they had a chance to ask questions, and it was understood, but on the procedural base, some of it's more specific. So like with NFPA 58 4.4, when you got to be trained under the standard of that code and refreshed every 3 years, it really gets more into the weeds. For instance, if you're going to do tank evacuations, you not only got to have the theory, the knowledge portion of it, but you have to do the hands-on. So the hands-on includes the steps, the process of how you evacuated a tank, and the employee's training record should reflect that. Same with doing DOT cylinder requalification. Same with installing tanks. There really needs to be, and a lot of folks use the CTEP protocol, the knowledge-based as well as the skill evaluation-based documentation to help fulfill those training records that are required. Not only for NFPA 58, but a lot of them help fulfill the OSHA and the DOT training requirements. So having those
Very
detailed
good.
records.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, if there's no other questions, we'll move into these case studies, and you'll have an opportunity to ask some questions here at the end as well. First case study really results in a water heater and a furnace that was installed. It was actually the son-in-law of the homeowner that installed the equipment. I said, what's wrong with this picture? For those that are looking at the picture, naturally that's a Category 3 power vent water heater and a Category 4 high efficiency furnace that was installed. And it's kind of hard to see, and I'll just give you actually what took place. The son-in-law installed the furnace and the water heater. The air intake to the furnace was tied into the water heater exhaust, vent exhaust. I'll go back to the picture. If you notice there, the actual air intake for the furnace is connected to the power vent water heater's exhaust. And the exhaust of the furnace, which the son-in-law thought was the air intake, had it been piped to the outside, this situation may not have happened other than the furnace might have been plugged up with soot, but he piped it down below and had it terminating in the basement. So while he thought he was drawing air from the basement, he was actually putting the exhaust into the basement of the house. So the propane company was short-handed, and they were really dead set on taking care of customers as quickly as they could. So the manager decided, had no one available to go do the tank set and the hookup. Manager documented everything was okay as part of the inspection. Here's what was documented as part of the inspection. Suitable for LP, yes. Regulator and tank or bottle legal and safe, yes. Area, materials, and sizes of lines within piping systems suitable, yes. Appliances properly vented, yes. So he documented something that was incorrect. So what happened? The customer died from CO poisoning. There was a criminal investigation, which included the propane manager as well as the son-in-law to see if they were in cahoots. Nothing was ever proven in regards to any criminal activity there. And the propane company ended up settling a large undisclosed claim with the family. So in review of this case study, what could have been done? I mean, you may not catch everything, but it really gets back to your training policy. Whether you're management, whether you're field personnel, whether you're part-time, full-time, how are you trained? Are you being refreshed on your training? How does your company handle new tank installations and system inspections? We often get rushed in haste, and even this time of the year it gets very difficult. Very good, and it's so easy to cut corners or not slow down and take the time necessary to do the detailed inspections, do the leak checks as required, because we're in such a busy time of the year. So really taking a look at that internally to see how you handle that stuff. And then also, one thing to consider, and it may not have helped in this case, but photo documentation. I'm a strong believer of photo documentation and having a mechanism to have that added to your customer file, digitally stored on a customer file, having someone review that information as it comes in, maybe not only for installation of equipment, but really for tank installations, regulator installations, to ensure that they meet the distance requirements and that there's no code issues. And it will also help you with your customers if something changes at their property, and now you have to have a conversation stating that you have to do a change of their system because now the AC condenser is too close to either the tank or too close to the regulator. And you have documentation on how you initially installed it as well. So it's unfortunate that someone would have to die from an improper installation. Case study 2 is day before an explosion, family had smelled something throughout their that they thought was propane. They had a 500-gallon tank, so they called their company. Their company alleged, or when the CSR answered the phone, first thing they did was look up the account. They knew the account was on credit hold. The account needed a delivery, but hadn't paid their bill on time. So they dismissed it as you're smelling gas it was alleged smelling gas due to low level in your tank. Propane company stated it was not able to do a refill on a near empty tank because the billing office was closed for the day. So it was late in the afternoon. The billing office was closed, so they couldn't release it for delivery. So customer didn't want to wait. That evening, they ended up hooking up their own 100-pound cylinder so they could have showers in the morning and use their stove to cook breakfast. The odor was pretty strong that evening, so several of the family members went to stay at the neighbors. However, the mother, the father, and the 14-year-old daughter remained in the property. They were getting ready for work and school at 6 a.m. when the house exploded. And the 14-year-old daughter, she was found dead, buried under debris in the back portion of the house, and was killed by the blast. So the propane or the plaintiff's attorney claimed the company was negligent by not coming out to check the smell the day before. And they settled for somewhere around $1.3 million and didn't take it to trial. So really, when you look at how we handle these, and that's the aftermath, and naturally some investigation took place, so a lot of it was cleaned out, but the house was completely gone. So when you look at this, how do you handle odor complaint calls? Really, I would encourage you to always treat those as priority service calls, even if you're just going to go out and lock the system down. If there's going to be who's responsible, are they going to pay or not going to pay? I never let anything get in the way of responding on an odor complaint. If they simply don't want their system fixed or checked, simply lock off your tank to ensure that they're going to be safe. Do you have a clearly defined policy and procedure? It starts with the call and how we handle that call. Do we handle or treat past due or billing issue customers differently? We should treat all of our customers the same, as regardless of whether or not they owe us anything or not. They may be restricted from the delivery, but if they have an odor or they're complaining of an odor, we should follow protocol. And I would truly encourage you to have a checklist of how to handle leaks inside and odor complaints outside, and what is actually provided as far as the warnings to that consumer when they make that phone call. So the script is very important, and having that so everybody understands the script. Even if you're digitally recording your calls, you want to make sure you provide the same safety information and warnings each and every time you receive that call. And then give some thought to how would you have handled this call. And then the last case study really has to do with interruption of service. It's stressful times for us when we have interruption of services. It's not necessarily where we created the interruption of service. It could be unplanned. It could be a regulator freeze-up. It could be a will call customer that didn't call us early enough to get on schedule. It could be that customer that didn't pay their bill that created the interruption of service. So this case study has to do with a company that propane driver responds to an out of gas call. Pretty much does everything correctly, performs the product transfer, conducts a leak check, documents that leak check, and per the driver's understanding of company policy, offers to relight the pilot. Customer, she was home with her small child, and for whatever the reason, didn't feel comfortable allowing the driver into the house without her husband being present. So reports that the husband will relight when he returns from work later that day. Driver documents the interruption of service, documents the leak check, but did not document that he had offered to restart the system and the customer refused. He did not document that portion of it. Didn't go as planned later that day with the husband relighting. He was burned and there was property damage. So what is your policy in regards to how do you handle these? If they refuse to allow you to do what you say you're going to do as a company, do you lock off the system? Do you not restart systems? Do you warn them and let them know of the hazards of trying to attempt to restart systems? Employees should never provide instruction to a consumer on how to restart an appliance. If the consumer cannot restart it based on instructions provided by the manufacturer of the appliance, and they truly need a qualified service technician. How do you note this information? I'm not a strong believer of putting things on delivery tickets because they may not make it to the right department, meaning the service group, but have a systematic approach on how you're going to turn in. I recommend having a simple customer site issue form, or you can have a small work order that can use to document leak checks, but putting refusals or denials is very important. Even if a customer refuses to sign, putting that they refuse to sign. Or if they're not home to sign your documentation, put no one home to sign. Simply leaving customer signature blank doesn't help you. You really need to put why it wasn't signed. And then do you warn of the dangers of customers lighting their own appliances? And you need to document everything in the transactions and the things you have happening with your customers, as well as the warnings you provided. So with that being said, this company did nothing wrong. They still ended up spending about $250,000 before they got out of that lawsuit from the husband trying to relight their appliances. And plaintiff's attorneys are pretty smart. They will get out there and look at your website. They'll see your service offerings, what your delivery offerings are, some of the statements you have. So they will, in this case, they went right to the website and saw what this company was offering as part of, this is the services we provide. So I'll go ahead and show a sample table of contents. And we can send this to anybody that would like a copy of this. I'm not saying that you need all of these. There's about 90 of them on this list. I've been in the industry a long time. But these are things you can look at, make decisions based on what you currently have, or maybe you don't have any and you're looking to get some policies and procedures put in place. So there's eight sections here. General, naturally, you always should have at least a health, safety, training mission. And then when it comes to personnel and training, this is where you can really spell out all the policies and procedures based on certain things. So a lot of this is OSHA related. Some of it's DOT related. How do you respond on propane leaks? That's very important. And then vehicle safety, having some general safety rules. And then having that cell phone and electronic device use, hours of service, things of that nature. And then if you have propane bulk plants, there's requirements there as well. So, do you do daily, weekly, monthly inspections? Do you do your annual testing of your ESVs? Do you have an emergency action plan? Emergency action plans are required under OSHA. They need to be written. If you have more than 10 employees, they can be verbally communicated if they're 10 and less at the location, but you need to document you did that training with your employees. And having your fire safety analysis, your operations and maintenance plans for your bulk plants. And then there's stuff for containers, installation of containers, transporting of the containers, your bobtail operations, loading and unloading, your pre-fill safety inspection, out-of-gas deliveries on how do you handle those, the evacuating of containers using compressor, pump, Venturi vac method, and then installation procedures. So those are all just recommendations. So if anybody wants a copy of this, Michelle, myself, or Ted would be happy to provide you with this. And then lastly, I just want to show you a sample policy. This happens to be an out-of-gas delivery policy. So you always, it's a policy with a procedure. So naturally, you're going to have a policy statement. So it's going to really say what needs to happen. And you're going to have a scope of what the intent is. And it's critical, like it says here, procedures when delivering and restoring service for an out-of-gas account. And then the training, making sure people are properly trained and competent and that they've been evaluated to ensure that they know how to handle this procedure. And then the most important part of this is the procedure itself. Delivery with turn on, so you have appliances accessible, how to handle that product transfer, do the leak check and reinstate service, but more importantly, what to do if you're not able to reinstate that service. So the employee knows, do I fill the tank? Do I do a leak check? Do I lock the tank off? Do I tag the system out of service? So understanding how to handle that is very important. And how to secure the system, whatever your mechanism is on securing system, and then what warning tags. And I strongly recommend using the PERC warning tags. They have an orange warning tag, and then they have this 3-part tag that is really good for an out of gas, where you leave one on the handle on the container valve, one at a door where they may enter the house and then bring one back as part of your safety program. So that concludes the presentation. We'll now open it up for questions. And as I mentioned, if there's anything you need or any additional information, my colleague Michelle Wilson will be happy to provide you with, or myself and or Ted from the Pennsylvania Petroleum Association.
Excellent. Eric, thank you. We did have another question come in. Again, if you do have one, we encourage you to type one into the go to webinar question section. Eric, if you could you please elaborate more on if a company has policies and procedures in place that go beyond the necessary requirements, how that may or may not place them into a higher exposure from a liability standpoint?
Okay, that's a very good question. I work with a lot of attorneys, and what attorneys will tell me, and in fact, when you have policies and procedures, if you know you're not going to do certain things that go above and beyond, don't have it in your policy or your procedure. However, if you meet the minimum standards for codes and regulations, but you're wanting to raise your level of care for your customer by having certain best practices, including you're not going to be held to a higher standard per se because you're trying to provide a higher level of care. So let's say you only hit that target 90% of the time. Well, 90% of the time, you're providing higher level care than what even the code minimum requirements are. So in that light, you're attempting to do more for your customer safety as opposed to just meeting the minimum standards. While anybody can be sued, but you can show you're trying to provide a higher level of care. So only thing I would say is if you know you're not going to do something on a regular basis and it's a best practice, don't include it. But if you're attempting to change the safety culture and you want to provide a higher level of care, I would say include it and train your employees on it.
Very good. That makes sense. We had another question come in, but it's more of a request for either Eric or Michelle to follow up. So at this time, if we don't have any more questions for the webinar, we'd like to thank you for getting on it. Michelle and Eric's information is on the screen, so if you have something, please follow up with them directly. But Eric, thank you again, and thank you everyone else for getting on this morning.
My pleasure. Have a great day.
Take care.